That'll look at our top stories. Time now to see what's making business and financial news. Cole Stengler joins us in the studio. Morning to you, Cole.
Good morning.
Beginning with reports here in France that French workers are starting to feel the effects of a key reform from President Emmanuel Macron.
That's right, William. Since the start of the year, those working overtime here in France haven't had to pay income taxes or social charges on that extra pay. Now, this applies to work that's done beyond 35 hours a week. That's the working week in France. It's a change that was introduced by the French president last December as a response to the Yellow Vest demonstrations. Now, like the government's move to expand a subsidy for low-wage workers, the goal here is to help boost purchasing power, but is it making a difference? After all, former President Nicolas Sarkozy once applied the very same policy. Alison Sargent breaks it down.
This manager works 4 hours of overtime a week. Since the French government stopped deducting social charges from the added income, she's been taking home an extra 36 euros a month.
It's just a small raise, which is always good, of course. But it's less than I was expecting personally.
She won't be paying any income taxes on her overtime either. The French president announced the measures at the end of last year in response to Yellow Vest protesters. Since January, the government says that 1/3 of French employees have benefited. On average, each of them worked 11 hours of overtime a month. For an employee with a monthly salary of 1,500 euros, those 11 extra hours mean an extra 50 euros. It comes without costs for employers, but this boss is skeptical that the measure will last. It was already put in place by Nicolas Sarkozy in 2007, and then taken away in 2012 by his successor, François Hollande.
We went through this several years ago, and it stopped from one day to the next. We had employees who found themselves with less purchasing power because their overtime was no longer tax exempt.
Boosting purchasing power is the government's main goal. It's increased by 0.4% since the measure was put in place at the start of the year.
For the second time in as many weeks, one of President Donald Trump's picks for the Federal Reserve has dropped out of consideration. The U.S. President tweeting last night that Stephen Moore would no longer be seeking a seat on the board of America's central bank. He called him a great pro-growth economist. Now, Moore was seen as an ally of the president's in his attempt to get the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates. Instead, the Fed has moved in the opposite direction, spurning Trump and gradually hiking borrowing costs. Moore's nomination came under scrutiny for this very reason, but also for past writings about women that were regarded by many as sexist. The economist and former conservative commenter was facing an uphill battle as well for confirmation in the Senate. The pilot strike is finally over at Scandinavian Airlines. The flag carrier of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark says it's reached a deal to put an end to the week-long work stoppage. The strike forced the carrier to cancel 4,000 flights, leaving nearly 400,000 passengers stranded. Unions are declaring victory, pointing to a pay hike as well as improved predictability around their scheduling, one of their major demands. Management, for its part, is also feeling relieved and hoping to move forward.
The Swedish airline industry is facing a difficult period. We talk about flight shame. We talk about taxes on flights. We talk about the price of oil and a weak Swedish crown. At the same time, SAS needs to develop the financial muscle to create long-term profitability, to be able to finance our large fleet orders and the resources to move toward viable fossil-free travel.
Turning now to today's trading action. Not so much movement so far in the major European indices, which have just opened. Investors there, we're seeing the CAC 40 down just slightly, the FTSE up just slightly, the DAX just below the flat line as well. Investors really looking ahead later in the day to the jobs data coming out in the United States from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That monthly report slated to be released later today, closely watched by investors across the world. Next up, the European steel industry may not be dead just yet. British Steel has won approval from a court in France to buy the Ascoval mill in northern France. It allows the British company to expand in Europe at a time when its domestic economy is reeling from the uncertainty of Brexit. The deal is also expected to help save jobs at the site, which employs 270 workers. Their fate has been up in the air the last 4 years since the restructuring plan was first announced. French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire was at the steel mill to celebrate the court's decision.
The French industry has its future ahead of it, in front of it. And if we give ourselves the means, if we invest, if we innovate, if we remain attractive, if we promote the competence of our employees, The French industrial know-how? Well, French industry will no longer be written in the 19th or 20th century. It will be written in the 21st century. And it is you, the workers, the employees, who will write that history. You're the ones who will write a new page in French industrial history.
And finally, Uber is under fire yet again from taxi drivers, this time in Australia. Cab drivers say Uber gained an unfair advantage and destroyed their livelihoods by knowingly operating above the law. It's according to a class action suit filed Friday. It's not the first time the ride-hailing company has faced allegations like this from drivers. In March, Uber settled a lawsuit in the U.S. for $20 million, centered over whether cabbies had been improperly classified as independent contractors. Either way, this latest legal challenge comes at an unfortunate time for the company. It's currently barreling ahead towards its initial public offering on Wall Street, preparing to sell 207 million shares. So, William, not so sure if you want to be getting those Uber shares just yet.
No, have to sit and wait on that. Thank you very much, Cole. Cole Stengler with a look at what's making business news.